Hi everybody, welcome back to NoPro Worship. My name is David Wesley. This week we're continuing our mini-series on the acoustic guitar and playing it in support of a worship team. And today we'll be focusing on playing in the key of C. This is actually the fourth key that we've been looking at, and it's important to remember that when you're playing guitar in a particular key, it's a little different than piano. It has particular chord shapes that affect the flavor, the color of the sound. So every key sounds a bit different. So you can take a look at the videos that we already did for the keys of G, E, and D. So the key of C is kind of interesting in that it's the first key that you learn how to play in on the piano. And that's because it has no accidentals, no sharps, no flats in the key signature. And physically speaking, it means you're only playing on the white keys and not on the black keys. So as a beginning piano player, this makes it the easiest key to read off of sheet music, and initially it makes it the easiest key to play in. Now, as you become more advanced, at least in my experience, as your fingers go a little bit more freely along the keyboard, C actually becomes a little more challenging to play in because those black keys give you a bit of a reference for your hands when you're moving up and down the keyboard, but that's a topic for another video. For the guitar, the key of C actually isn't terribly popular. I think it comes way in behind the keys of G, D, and E in terms of the keys that songs are written in and perhaps performed in. In the context of the church, I think you'll most often find songs done in the key of C because they were originally written in D or E, and they were dropped down a couple of tones to be more friendly for the vocal range of the congregation. So what we'll do now is walk through the primary chords found in the key of C in the order of their importance. If you're wondering at all about what the Roman numerals are all about and why we do it in this particular order, you can check out the first video on the key of G for a little bit more context. As always, we'll start with the number 1 chord, and in the key of C, that is, you guessed it, C. It's an easy chord to play. It uses 5 out of the 6 strings, so it's reasonably powerful. Now, as the number 1 chord or the root chord, I think it's really important to have a somewhat powerful chord serving as your number 1. So in the key of D, where you only get to use the top 4 strings, I find that a bit wimpy, and that's one of the reasons why I prefer playing in C ahead of D. However, there is something that's done very commonly in contemporary music, and specifically in contemporary Christian music, that makes C a little bit more challenging to play in. And that little motif is going from the major chord to the suspended chord. And this often happens with your number 1 chord. So you can do it really easy in the other keys. So let me just show you. You can go from D to D sus. You can go from G to G sus. G sus is the holiest of all chords, if you didn't know. You can go from E to E sus, and you can go from A to A sus, all by putting down just 1 finger. C is the exception to that rule. You can't just put down 1 finger to transition to the suspended version. You have to put down your finger, and you need to fret the top 2 strings with a single finger without fretting the G string. I find this difficult, and I'm pretty sure I've actually never tried it on stage because I simply don't play guitar often enough to make it worthwhile to master that chord. So there is an easier alternative that isn't quite a pure form of that chord. What you can do that connects it to the same transition in the other keys is that you can just put down 1 finger, and that's your pinky finger on the A string, and that actually turns into an add 4 chord. So you have the 1, 3, 4, and 5 notes of the chord. So you go from C to that C add 4. So there's some slight dissonance in there, but you do get to have the benefits of that other sound. So even though the C suspended chord is a little bit trickier to get to, there are some variations of the C chord that are extremely easy to get to that you reach just by adding or taking away 1 finger. For example, you have your C7 chord, you have your C major 7 chord, your C add 9, and there's also just a regular variation of the C major chord that lets you fret a high G on that top E chord, which is really helpful for transitioning to the number 5 chord in the key of C is G. It's an easy, open-sounding chord. Now, when we talked about that transition from the alternate version of the C chord to the G, The reason why it's an easy transition is that your pinky finger is anchored on that top E string, which makes it a physically easy transition, but also because your finger is still down, it allows that top E string to keep ringing out, which means that it's an audibly smoother transition as well. The number 4 chord in the key of C is F, and this is where we run into a bit of a snag because F is one of those dreaded bar chords that amateur players like myself don't particularly like. So if you're lazy, creative, and you don't want to do the bar chord, you can, in many cases, but not all cases, use a close variant or cousin of the F chord called the F major 7. It doesn't work all the time, but it works an awful lot. And one of the benefits of using that is it's a very smooth transition coming from the C chord back and forth to that F major 7. And there's so many notes in common between the C, the A minor, and that F major 7 that it really makes an easy transition amongst all three. The number 6 chord in the key of C is A minor. Now, A minor is a great chord because there's a number of different variations you can use if you want to achieve a certain kind of color or tone, or you can choose them based on the chord that you're coming from or going to make the smoothest transition. For example, if you're coming from the C chord, the easiest variation to go to is the A minor 7th because all you're doing is actually lifting one finger. That being said, if you were going to a G chord, you might want to use this variation of the A minor 7th to transition. So again, it's a smoother transition for your fingers and it's audibly smoother for the ear. The number 2 chord in the key of C is D minor. Now, it's not a terribly difficult chord to hit on its own. However, some of the transitions to the other chords in the key, except for maybe G, are a little bit more difficult just because of where your fingers are placed on the board. It's quite different from the other chords. The other downside of the D minor chord is that you're only playing the top 4 strings, so the chord isn't very strong. And when you're playing a song that emphasizes the number 2 chord, for example, it could be the first chord of the song, when you're starting with such a light, weak chord as D minor, it might not be the best choice to do it in the chord shape of C. So those are all the primary chords in the key of C. C isn't my favorite key to play in, but I definitely put it above the key of D, which is used very commonly. In fact, when I'm playing guitar for another worship leader and they're playing in the key of D, most of the time I will take out my capo and put it on the 2nd fret and I will play in the chord shape of C. It gives me a stronger number 1 chord to sort of anchor the song. It gives me the smooth voice leading between the number 1, number 4, and number 6 chords, and I just find that it's a better sound. So thanks so much for hanging out with me for the last couple of minutes as we looked at playing guitar in the key of C. Now, this video series on guitar really isn't meant for guitar players. In fact, if you play guitar regularly on a worship team at your church, you are most undoubtedly a better guitar player than me. No, these videos are really meant for the people that play with you and the worship leaders that lead guitarists. It's really important for especially piano-based musicians and leaders to recognize that when guitar players play in particular keys, there are strengths and weaknesses in terms of the difficulty of the key, as well as the sound and the color and just the overall energy you get from different keys. If I had to pick a target audience for this video, it would actually be myself 15 years ago. These are the things that I wish I had known 15 years ago as a piano-based worship leader. I make these NoPro worship videos because I believe God's people deserve leaders that grow. Now, for me, part of that growth was stepping out of my comfort zone and learning a new, somewhat intimidating instrument because I wanted to learn how to lead guitar players more effectively. And it's been my great pleasure to share some of what I've learned with you. As a piano-based worship leader, I found it's made my job a lot easier. These videos are made possible by my patrons on Patreon. If you're interested in supporting this ministry, you can head to patreon.com/DavidWesley. And I hope you'll join me next Friday as we wrap up this video series on the various keys you play on guitar with our final key of A.